Let's jump right into a genuinely grim, dark fable today. In this explainer, we're going to explore the terrifying extremes of evolution by translating some incredibly dense cosmic horror into a highly structured, mythic journey. We'll be using the framework of the Fichtean dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, to map out how entities in the hidden realms either completely consume reality or fiercely affirm it. We're going to trace this devastating path all the way from a hyper-cerebral ego to a vampire sovereign, and then contrast that with a massively eruptive, chaotic force.
We're literally starting this descent with just one word: Kimoda. Now, it looks simple enough on the surface, right? But this is a horrific scream of jagged nihilism that echoes through the very molecular bonds of the sea. When this word is spoken in the hidden realms, it effectively rewrites reality into a silent and parched blank page. It is, for all intents and purposes, the ultimate sound of unmaking.
So, that brings us to our thesis. The saline nightmare begins.
Okay, let's unpack this wild concept of inverted apotheosis. Normally, an apotheosis is an ascension, like a climb toward divine light, spiritual enlightenment, or some foundational yes to existence. But here, it's completely inverted. We're talking about an entity ascending toward absolute nihilism and parasitic will. It's a total rejection of providence. To really get a grasp on this, we're going to look at its most prominent example, a figure known simply as the Captain, whose journey actively consumes the very possibility of being.
What's super interesting here is how the Captain's journey completely subverts traditional fictitious self-consciousness. So the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte argued that the ego, the absolute I, defines itself through friction with the outside world. But the Captain flips this entirely on its head. Instead of using friction to define his self, he acts as a destructive check. He doesn't want to interact with the world to know himself. He wants to consume the possibility of anything else even existing. To him, all biological life is basically just water waiting to be stolen. He is the absolute ultimate vacuum.
And you can actually trace the mechanics of this inversion step by step. First, he utilizes something called chaos water. Second, he uses it to dismantle the hypercerebral ego of King Glaucus. Then, in a stroke of terrifying genius, he takes the king's own divine lightning and turns it into a conductor for global material desiccation. He literally dries out the world. Finally, this journey ends with his dissolution into a completely dry reality where he surpasses the law of final entropy. Emerging as the vampire sovereign, he has officially achieved his saline nightmare.
Which brings us to the antithesis, the Dionysian red specter.
Enter the red specter. Seriously, if the Captain is the absolute void, this entity is the sharp, vitalizing counterpoint that totally shatters the stagnant, gray shadow life of the hidden realms. It represents the divine madness and terrifying savagery of the Dionysian spirit. We're talking about an eruptive, twice-born power. It's known as the Eater of Raw Flesh, a resident of the Obsidian Sea that basically bridges the mortal and the divine. Where the Captain drains life to leave a blank page, the Red Spectre is this raw, untamed force of reality that violently collides with stagnation, forcing a chaotic evolution. While lesser beings might just fear it as a monster, the true Overman invites this chaotic beast in, integrating its raw power to fuel radical growth.
But, how do you actually harness that kind of power? Encountering this specter is a heroic climb up the jagged rocks of the soul. It's definitely not a passive experience. It demands that one, metaphorically, and honestly maybe even literally in this mythos, write with blood. This whole process rejects the passive masses in favor of fellow climbers who can actually endure the shattering insights of the abyss. Writing with blood transforms a simple pulse into a timeless proverb. It's pretty much the ultimate act of creation in an otherwise destructive universe.
So the crucial takeaway here is this intense ultimate contrast. On one side, you have the absolute vacuum of the Captain, terminal thirst, the saline nightmare, and passive nihilism. Pitted directly against that is the red specter, metabolic fire, primordial joy, and heroic affirmation. The specter's metabolic fire of the soul literally consumes nihilism itself. It takes the bitter venom of fate and turns it into high-octane fuel for evolution. It's this massive clash of cosmic forces, the urge to unmake versus the violent urge to create.
Now, let's look at the synthesis of all this, a graveyard of hubris.
Because when these two competing cosmic voids actually collide, the drive toward absolute zero and the drive toward chaotic, explosive growth, it transforms the world into a lightning-scarred graveyard of hubris. And look, the Captain and the Spectre aren't the only ones playing this cosmic game. We see other related dark transformations too. Take the Pale Inquisitor, for instance. Triggered by an emerald staff, he undergoes a dark apotheosis, where he weaponizes the primal id, the silver wolf, to entangle the psyche in this suffocating web of verdant iron. Then you have the Soothsayer, who uses a skeletal mask to achieve an active apotheosis, moving past passive nihilism to dismantle the fetish of form. Both are actively trying to cage existence or weaponize chaos, just adding to this massive graveyard of hubris.
Now, quietly observing this entire doomed timeline is a figure known as the Baron von Nixt. He watches the collapse, watches this graveyard form, and he recognizes the captain's absolute transcendence. In response to this, he invites the captain to join the Der Villa mythos within the Uncanny Mirror universe.
And this is where it gets wild. This transition actually turns the Baron from a clinical unmaker, just a casual observer of the void, into a literal fleshly bridge for the surviving saline nightmare. The nightmare doesn't just end, it crosses over, completely facilitated by the Baron's own dark architecture. Finally, we reach the connection, the mystical marriage and amor fati. So you might be wondering, how does anything survive this kind of cosmic fallout? Well, it takes a mystical marriage. You have to bind the primordial, chaotic, emotional energy of the Red Spectre to the structured Apollonian mask of form. You absolutely need that structure and chaos to bind together. And this brings us to the ultimate philosophical weapon in our fable, amor fati. It's a radical, total embrace of fate. It takes the sacred ingredient of suffering and transforms it into a primordial joy that just screams yes to the totality of existence. By embracing the specter's savage root, the Overman transcends being a mere victim in that graveyard of hubris. They counter the gray truth of the Sovereign of Gast and the terminal thirst of the Vampire Sovereign. They stop being prey and they become a dithyambic singer, a loud, clear voice of chaotic, beautiful, heroic affirmation. As we wrap up our descent into this mythic explainer, I want to leave you with a question to ponder about your own relationship with fate and creation. When you're faced with the crushing weight of the universe, will you surrender to the gray shadow life of passive nihilism, just drying out like the captain's victims? Or will you invite the savage beast to the feast of your soul, turning the bitter venom of fate into the metabolic fire of your very own evolution? Something to think about until next time.